Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Philip. How are
Hello.
you?
Hi. Good. Good. Nice to see you. So welcome to participate in this lecture series. So I will make a brief introduction firstly, and then you start to make the lecture. So actually, it's a very longer version of the lecture. So if you want to make a break in the middle, that's okay. I'll go all the way almost 2 hours, and something you can leave some time for discussion, I think. Yeah. So wait some moments. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, all the Digital Future participants, and also including PhD Consortium participants. So it's a great honor tonight. We invite Professor Alejandro Giacobolo to make a lecture today. This is actually the evening session of the lecture series. And the last 2 days, we already have Andrew Witt from Harvard GSD and Shixiao Li from UVA make 2 fantastic lectures. And tonight goes to the third one of the evening session. And in the morning session, we have New Leach to give 6 lectures as a sequence based on the topic of common flagellatory visit. So I would like to briefly to introduce the sequence of events, and also this is a PhD consortium. So the students in Tongji, if you take the credits for this project, you should turn in your paper before July the 3rd, 2023, and also the weight and based on the attendance and also the class performance engage into the discussions, and also the final review based on the 2,000 words essay, and based on any reflection to the professor's lectures. So ADF, Architecture Digital Future, is actually a platform we set up 2011, and which is a sharing education content platform. We already upload more than 300 lectures onto the YouTube and Bilibili of Digital Futures. Actually, the viewers already more than 1.5 million. And this is a sharing platform. We try to educate a group of community, the people who are growing on this digital platform, actually learning from this platform, and some of them already become the teachers, advisors, teach on this platform. So we're sharing the newest knowledge on not only the philosophy, but also the computational design and the fabrication technologies. And it is a broad platform, try to cross the threshold and sharing the knowledge across culture and cross discipline. And also including China, we have more than 300 schools have a digital architecture department, but seldom have opportunity to directly to learn from the avant-garde and also the pioneer architects from the high level from the different universities. So it's a great opportunity here to set up this platform, sharing platform to more people. And actually the participants all over the world, you can see, and from different continent over the past 12 years. So we try to build it going even further. So this year we have, next week, we'll start the workshops. We have 23 offline workshops in Tongji, and also we have 5 online workshops also start from next week, and as well as more than 10 workshops in Hefei, China, and also New Reach organized another like 30 to 40 workshops at the end of July. So it's totally, we have like around 80 workshops which happen around the world based on different languages, based on different hubs. So this is a sharing platform, not only the theoretical courses as tonight Giacomo gave us, but also including the online, offline workshops as well. Last year, actually, we launched a journal based on Digital Futures community. And the topic title for this journal is Architecture Intelligence. And we try to attract the PhD students and avant-garde architects and also professors to contribute their newly research, newly thinking on smart habitat, virtual habitat, and spatial habitat, and try to introduce the design, any scenarios like the simulation, optimization, construction, operation in the whole lifestyle of the architecture. And also it's a cross-discipline platform, including architecture discipline, civil engineering discipline, environmental engineering, computer science, the social science, and the philosophy research as well. So this is the website at the bottom. So if you have any research papers, welcome to turn in your paper to this special platform. We already published 2 issues, and the 3rd issue will be published in July. So that is the publishing platform. Tonight is a great honor for me to introduce Alejandro Zaropolo, who is right now the principal of the AZP-ML. And as we know, he used to teach as the former dean in University of Princeton, and he actually got his educate in Spain, bachelor degree in Spain, and I'm Mark from the graduate school GSD Harvard University, and also he used to work for the office of OMA in Rotterdam, and after that he established the very famous office FOA, who is a founder. For that one, he started the practice from 1993 for his own office, and later he established another platform named AZP-ML. As a agency practice to after FOA to continue his new practice. And besides the practice, Alejandro also working as a dean, as we know, in Princeton, and he was a professor between 2012 to 2021, and he has been a visiting professor at Yale, Columbia, UCLA, and used to be the unit master at AA in London as well. He has been the frequent contributor to professional publications such as Aerococus, Contents, A+U, Archi Plus, Log, LOG, AD, and Harvard Design Magazine, which also very interesting different academic journals. So he also published a sequence of books, a number of books, including the Sniper's Log, LOG, and also Architecture Chronicle of Generation X in Actor, and also Imminent Commons, Urban Questions for the Near Future Expanded City, in 2017, and Ecology of the Building Envelope A Material History and Theory of Architectural Surface, which published in 2021 Actor publisher. The Post-Truth University, which published very new recently in 2023, Academia Press, Washington Academia Press, the Post-Truth University. So a lot of publishing books. I think we admire Alejandro, not only for his practice, but also I think a lot of theory. He actually a very good theorist in architecture. So it's a great honor tonight. We invite Alejandro to give us a special lecture topic. The name of the lecture is The End of Manners. So it's an interesting topic. We try to see after the COVID-19 is the new stage is starting. And the last two lectures also mentioned the paradigm shift in the architecture world. Academia professors and practitioners make a lot of thinking on that. So we're looking forward. Alejandro give us his own thinking to the future and his own thinking on the theory of architecture. So welcome, Alejandro Zaropolo. The screen is yours. Thank you.
Just a second. Thank you very much, Philippe, for the invitation to be here today. Let me see if I can make this work. I guess I have to go first. Share screen. Okay, and now I can start, hopefully, the presentation. Can you see the title?
Yes. Yes, very well.
Okay, so I'm grateful for the invitation. As I say, I don't know. I mean, this looks like an incredibly long lecture, 2 hours. I don't know whether I will have to retrieve some other projects after.
Yeah, we can follow by like 20 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Very good. So basically, I was kind of a little bit challenged by the context of the lecture, Digital Futures Initiative, and I would like to relate to address specifically the question of the digital futures in the light, perhaps, of other things, and be a little bit provocative about it. I am probably not a kind of current expert in digital technologies, and that doesn't mean that I am not interested in them. They are. I've been all my life very interested in them, and in fact, I would like to start the lecture by stating that I am a dinosaur of digital technologies, and so in some ways, what I would like to do is to the way I think I can contribute to the discussion technologies is by perhaps making a certain suggestion or indication of where I think these technologies may go, and use some of our own work to illustrate that. But more in a kind of provocative manner, in a kind of counterintuitive manner on what probably most people would think is the future of digital technologies. So, as I said, I am a dinosaur. This is. I always say that I'm a member of a generation which was able, for the first time, to engage with digital technologies without having to become a computer expert. So before my generation, if you were committed to digital tools, you probably had to be working on that only. You couldn't be also an architect or a designer. And I think that this happens exactly in 1990. When I was studying at BSD at Harvard, I believe that at that time the change was incredible at the GSD at the time. I was the first, or my year, I was the only student who tried to do a thesis project using computers, and I was using a 486 computer with 4 megabytes of RAM to work. So the technology has evolved enormously. After the year after me, there were probably 6 people that did thesis with a computer, and the following year the school rewired entirely the trays so that everybody could connect to the desktops to the server. So that's basically where my my discovery of technologies comes from. This picture that I'm showing is myself presenting a project at the GSD in 1989 to guess who? Denise Scott Brown, Bill Mitchell, and Stephen Erwin, who probably, I don't know, I guess you know Denise Scott Brown and Bill Mitchell. Stephen Erwin was somebody was a professor that mediated between landscape and computer technology. Was not at the time, couldn't really understand the relevance of this, but he's probably one of the pioneers of GIS and this kind of things. And since this is about digital futures, I wanted to show you the digital pasts. This was basically the first project I ever did in a computer, and it was actually someone who was educated in conventional tools to be able to move to a kind of medium where you would be able to look at, probably every student in the world, this is irrelevant. The fact that you could see transparency and that you could move the object three-dimensionally was an incredible change in the way we used to work, and we used to work like in between the computer model and basically conventional pencils. So this I wanted to show you how did the work look like at the time when we were starting to work with computers. Used to kind of then move to physical models. These are some part of this research that I initiated at the time at the GSD, and that ended with my thesis, which was done under the direction of Ulhas. Then I kind of went on to work for him, but it was a kind of alternative to the Lille Convention Center, which was one of his projects at the time, and that this was the project, which was a large building with kind of warped floors, which was something that for the first time I could do. I mean, it would have been very difficult to do it with conventional means, but the fact that I had learned to use this tool allowed me to do this project. I just wanted to give you a little bit of the background of these technologies, and then at the AA, when I was tutor at the AA, the simple fact that I had been educated in an AutoCAD interface. I mean, I've been using AutoCAD ever since, and probably one of the people of my generation who can still use this and uses it. But then I'm obviously well behind most of you in terms of more contemporary technologies. But I wanted to show you these drawings, which I always say that we were the original parametrics before Patrick. I mean, at the time, Patrick was an expressionist working for Saha with conventional tools. So you can probably ask Patrick this the next time you see him. I think he will recognize that the first time he saw parametric work was in the AA, in my unit. And so what was interesting about the parametric work was that we were suddenly connecting design with quantification, design with something that we could measure and quantify. And so this was the work that we were producing at the time. In some ways, the interest of the parametric at the time was that as a kind of mechanism of estrangement. So instead of reproducing historical types of architecture, we were able, by using these parameters, to produce organizations that didn't resemble to any of the conventional typologies, and yet they were loaded with information that was quantifiable and measurable. And that this is work from my former unit at the AA long time ago. This is probably work dating back to 1997, 1996, 1997. And then, you know, we won an important project, the Yokohama project, that got built and that had started with all these ideas that were related to quantification, digitalization, computation, diagrammatic performance, and that was built by lofting between a sequence of sections that produce this form that, again, following some of the investigations, Harvard, for example, worked with warped floors to connect between levels in a large structure. And that, as you can see, this texture that used that then became wood, but actually in the competition was not supposed to be wood. It was simply the visual interface of AutoCAD using a rule surface. And as you can see, that we were using collage, so hybrid between Pantone and this kind of printouts from AutoCAD. But what was interesting of moving from there to the construction phase was that we realized how important the geometrical translation of this original three-dimensional diagram was to become. And so many of these considerations, I think, remain to me still very, very present in the way I understand the digital. I think the fundamental quality of the digital is that it is measurable. That everything that we design in space can be translated into quantities, into measurements, into mathematics. And I think this is the fundamental power of the technology, and the power that I believe that we should go back to in an age in which, as we will see, almost anything goes, anything can be produced or visualized, but everything is fake. And so that aspect, I mean, as you can see, the materialization of the project was really stressed the limits of the building technology, and so that kind of confrontation between the complex geometry of a 3D model and the reality of the building became, and the kind of roughness and crudeness of that transformation was for me a very important discovery, and since it got built, my field of interest probably moved more towards the production of buildings, the construction of buildings, and I frankly believe that many of the possibilities that the technologies provide us today may not necessarily be that relevant to the practice of in the physical world, and my suspicion is that perhaps some of the prevailing ones will not ever construct relevant architecture. So I mean, I've picked up some of the things that we see coming out of AI and kind of text driven AI generators. And I think what is interesting about looking at these things, which I think are interesting, I'm not in any way kind of dismissive of them, but I believe that we have to take them with a lot of care, because to me they are reminiscent of what we are seeing proliferating in the social political sciences, which is that the architecture has become purely a social construction, scrapped from internet images and driven by feelings or sensibilities. And I believe that while I think that there are certain things that can be socially constructed, architecture is not one. And neither is sexual identity, no matter how much do activists insist. So in some ways, what I mean, these are maybe some of the examples that I've found. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying whether these are good or bad or anything like that. They are interesting. However, I don't think that the digital, the architecture of the digital, the future of the architecture of the digital is this kind of image generation. And in fact, this lecture is mostly dedicated to, in a way, fight the idea that architecture can be socially constructed, as these images are, in a way, socially constructed because they are mixing tropes and images that the engines are sourcing from the internet. And I do not think that this will be a very relevant form of architecture in the age of Anthropocene, when the challenges are probably different. So in some ways, this presentation is working in order to challenge this kind of social constructivism that we have seen in the political arena, but also in the architectural field, and that I think needs to be now challenged. And I wanted to bring an interesting example that I like very much. It's a wonderful theory that I have known for some years and mention it in different places, which I believe is absolutely crucial for architects at this point, and is one of the best attacks on social constructivism. It's a theory that is explained by Jared Diamond in the book Gun, Germs, and Steel, and is called the theory of continental access. And so Diamond, who is the kind of nemesis of post-colonial scholars, starts by saying that the reason why Eurasia developed, was kind of the first colonial power, is because the dimension of the continent was the horizontal dimension of the continent was the largest one of any other continent. So that meant that populations could move for a longer length of space, could occupy space without changing latitude, climate, etc., etc., and therefore they could become quickly, they could develop quicker than other continents. I mean, it's very difficult to prove or disprove the theory, but it's a theory that I like in this because it is a theory where the space itself, the physical quality of space prevails over or determines everything else. So it's not because, so in a way, colonization or the origins of civilization occur in a certain location following this theory, because the dimension was one and not another. So I believe that this is basically what architecture does. This is the kind of very core of the practice, is to shape space so that certain things can happen. And I think it's very important to look at that power at a time when probably architecture is trying to resolve, you know, racial or ethnic or gender issues, is trying to, in a way, work to resolve human problems that are outside. I mean, not that the human problems are outside entirely, but I don't think can be immediately resolved by architecture, as maybe some of the kind of activist ideologues are stating. The last time I was there in Shanghai, I remember I explained this diagram, which I made in 2017 as part of a text published in El Croquis, that was in some way, I see it now as a kind of index of that confusion that has been produced in the discipline by this kind of anything goes, this idea that there are many different ways of doing architecture and everything is fine and we can go in different ways. And so we're trying to address that picture. I made this diagram, which Guillermo Fernandez, a former collaborator, and we basically, I mean, doesn't have any kind of claim of precision, but it was trying to understand what was happening with this kind of incredible diversity that in 2015 was almost like non-directional. Anything could happen here. There was no way of deciding what was the right way of practicing. And now, in some ways, what this lecture is trying to do is to say that we need to go back to this physical, measurable architecture in order to be able to say what is relevant and what is not. And not everything is, I think, is going to help us to deal with the problems that we can solve in the contemporary world. Funnily enough, you know, the CCA saw that diagram and kind of organized some sort of meeting with Charles Jenks to compare the diagram with the one he had done, also trying to explore this idea of multiple possibilities, which was what Jenks, who was so incredibly interesting and intelligent critic, promoted all his life. I remember him telling me that whether some years ago, obviously now he's dead, but he used to tell me all the time, well, you think that you're not postmodernist, but you are postmodernist. And I think he was right. He was right in the sense that we had grown into a world where everything was relative, and there was no longer a single truth, a single way of addressing things. And I now believe that is a problem. I think that the problem of that kind of relativism that we have grown in, and the way in which sometimes the tools, these kind of digital tools that we used to make architecture, are being used, is simply proliferate that indecision, that inability to approximate the truth, to approximate the right way, which is something that people are obviously and legitimately scared of. Think that we need to kind of converge into some sort of common belief. But I think in some ways, if the last lecture I made in Shanghai was about understanding that huge diversity, this lecture would be to try to do the opposite. That's why it's called the end of manners, because in some ways it's not as if architecture can have, for me, that's the kind of polemic that I want to forward here. It's not about many different manners of doing architecture. It's about trying to build an architecture that is grounded on some sort of approximation to the truth through measurement and quantification, which I believe are the real power behind digital tools. So I'm not going to show. I mean, for me, this sentence which is by Daniel Dennett, is very interesting and very much what I think inspires this purpose. So Dennett writes, postmodernism, the school of thought that proclaimed there are no truths, only interpretations, has largely played itself out in absurdity. But it has left behind a generation of academics in the humanities disabled by their distrust of the very idea of truth and their disrespect for evidence, settling for conversations, which nobody is wrong and nothing can be confirmed, only asserted with whatever style you can master. So what I think is crucial about this statement is that it relates this postmodern relativist approach to the devaluation of the very idea of truth. And I think that one of the problems that we have today in the world is precisely that, is that we have been for 4 decades living in this kind of postmodern world where it is impossible to agree on any truth, and therefore lying has become customary in politics, and this is a phenomenon that has been well explored by a number of theorists in the last few years, which I believe is intimately connected to the emergence of postmodernism, post-structuralism, the kind of collapse of the modernist idea of scientific architecture, if you want, whether it was right or wrong. It was a kind of in the modern period, there was a kind of belief that we could have this scientific approach to cities and buildings, and obviously these 40 years of modernism have more than 40 years. I think since the crisis of the 68, probably that paradigm collapses and the kind of postmodern and post-structuralist approaches arise, and I think the reality that we live in today, political reality, is very much created by this distrust of science and truth, and I think if we, in a way, the proposal that I would like to make is that it's the retrieval of this quantification, measurement, scientific approach that should, at this point, lead our practice. And so that all these phenomena has produced us phenomena that you all know: populist governments, this kind of idea that anything goes, anything can be socially constructed, is what is called also blank slatism. So there is no way of facts are no longer relevant. Sex is a feeling. It's not. Some people get cancelled for saying that is actually not a feeling. It's kind of in the DNA of people. Identities have emerged as made claims that are also demonstrably wrong using statistics. So in some ways, I think this whole phenomena of populism and social constructivism is the background against which I would like to pitch architectural proposals today, and I believe digital tools give us the possibility of doing so precisely because they are based on intimate, on calculation, on measurement, on numbers. So there are. I mean, what is the problem with this devaluation of truth? Is that now we have people who don't believe that humans are evolved from monkeys, and they believe in intelligent design again and deny evolutionary theories, or that they deny also climate change. They deny a number of things that I think most people thought by now were solidly grounded in science, but are now with this kind of general devaluation of truth falling apart. And this for example, this climate, I mean, we cannot really do very much as architects with the question of creationism, for example, but we can actually do something with the environment. We can do something with the kind of environmental degradation and pollution of the world, the water, the air, the degradation of the soils, etc., which is ultimately related to this fact, which is that we, as a civilization, have been emitting carbon for the last 150 years, and there's a kind of exponential growth of energy consumption since the 1950s. We can do something about this. We can, as architects, we can address these issues, and I believe that now is the time where, from this relativist view of anything goes in architecture, we say no, not everything goes. Only architectural strategies that are able to deal with this should be progressed. And so I know this sounds kind of radical, but for me, this is one of the things. I mean, I make this kind of analogy and say that the moment in which the postmodernist world that Charles Jenks was theorizing, we were saying, even if you think you're not a postmodern, you are still even if you do, let's say, modernist buildings, you are still a postmodern because you have this kind of a fundamental ambiguity or doubt about the world that you are doing, and therefore you can afford to have conversations and find your manner of doing architecture. But I think that for me, I mean, Charles Jenks died briefly before the COVID-19. I think it would be interesting to talk to him now after what has happened, and for me, COVID-19 in the near future will be seen as the moment which there is this end of manners, there is this end of the postmodern relativist indetermination, because it's a very brutal process that cut across gender, race, and identity, and basically brought everybody back to looking at quantifications and science, etc., etc. Now there are different questions now about whether the science was right or not, but the fact is that suddenly the whole world was looking at this at this moment of return to expertise, to intelligence, to data analysis, as opposed to some sort of playful exploration of languages and rhetorics and images that architecture had become before. So this kind of brutal relevance of scientific determination on architecture, so proxemics, confinement, this kind of ruthless biopolitics of COVID, the physics of airborne volatile organic components, etc., showed, I think, that this idea of architecture, urban culture, as a kind of man-made, socially constructed idea is not true. There are deeper things. There are material things that have to do with very concrete material organizations, and I think a return of that consciousness it's what inspired, and I think this is going to be actually after COVID. We are living through a horrible war, which I think is also in its brutality and physicality is also going to terminate the idea that anything goes. I mean, the war is based on some people saying that they are hunting Nazis in Ukraine, etc. I mean, like the level to which truth has been evaluated is incredible, and I think the war will be another moment in which some of this postmodern approach to reality is going to, or relativism is going to be replaced by some sort of ruthless choreographies of the case of COVID, proxemic distances, or biometric recognition, where almost individual identity as opposed to group identity can be measured, where this measurability and quantification is crucial, and where the naked eye is not sufficient to operate here. It is the kind of minute detail of the face rather than the obvious gesture and the representation of things that truly matters. It's this kind of precision and measurement that has to be placed at the center of future digital technology. So what is I think also interesting is that I believe postmodernism promoted a type of architecture that was almost immaterial. It didn't matter very much what was its physicality, and I think that is precisely that pandemic and war episodes that give us a kind of inevitable proof that the most basic physical issues are again crucial. So in the case of architecture, it's probably embodied energy, thermal transmittance, weight, carbon emissions that have turned artistic ambitions of postmodernism into some sort of vacuous ambition, and probably what we need to be able to look at now if we want to converge towards a true relevant architecture is the steel weight per square meter, or the megajoules per kilo, or the tons of carbon dioxide, or the concentrations of PM2.5 and VOCs that our architectures and cities are producing. That's why the idea of architecture as a maniera, as an art, as a manner, is going to, I wouldn't say it's going to disappear, but I think is going to be severely diminished by the new reality in which we live today. And this was very much the intuition that I had when I started writing the ecologies of the building envelope, which was the intuition that a return to building physics was full of political implications outside the molar regimes of the politics of identity and representation. So the idea behind the book was actually to look at construction rather than an architecture. And I would like to place here construction as I mean, I don't think that we should say that it's opposite in any way to digital technologies, but it is opposite to the idea of digital technologies used as a way of simply producing images. So I think that this attempt to go back to an architecture of truth, to escape through the discipline, the issues which are political and are serious of the post-truth, is this kind of return to construction, return to the detail of the DNA, the detail of the face in front of face recognition device. That minute detail, as opposed to the kind of general gesture or image, is what I believe is going to matter. And it is interesting that this whole book was based on some sort of epiphany when I was working the Venice Biennale in 2014, where we were given this kind of images showing a building and a mock-up of a project. And we realized that actually the buildings were very uninteresting compared to the details. Therefore, it looks as if there was a much higher level of intelligence in putting together a building in the detail than there was in making the project in the way that architects have traditionally done. So that idea that the detail was suddenly more relevant than the overall impression or image was very much part of this return to the building physics. And so the question here was, this is the way in which buildings used to be designed in the past. Very famous building, the Seagram building from Mies van der Rohe, designed a certain proportion with these kind of vertical lines, which are mullions. And so what is interesting is that it is actually what happens between these vertical lines. This is what happens between these vertical lines, which is that there are coal bridges, there are drainage channels, thermal barriers, mechanical fixations, air filtration, waterproofing, and other things that are not built socially, are material and are loaded with probably some of the most relevant charged issues that we can deal with today, which is air, pollution of air, etc., breathability, water, energy, light. These issues are decided. This space between the two lines of the mullion. And I don't know exactly how do we need to do, but I would like to propose to you the idea that it is precisely there where the most relevant issues for the discipline are located now. And so going back to this radical measurability, one of the things that we have done in the office, that's a partner, Maider, scientist also, or an architect, is to couple robot with wind tunnel, which funnily enough, last time I was in Shanghai, I saw that Philip had one much bigger than this one. So the idea that we can actually measure things and see how air moves and model urban microclimate, which is determined by the envelopes and the massing of the buildings, is something that we can do now and we can model now, and basically we can use in order to reveal processes that we couldn't see before. I think that this capacity to quantify, to model, using digital tools, the reality, the physical reality of the city is the path where I believe architecture should move on in order to redefine some sort of ambition, which goes in one single direction, not in many possible directions. I know that is scary, perhaps, especially to some of us who were educated in that kind of dispersion of the postmodern, but I think it's fundamentally obsolete idea. So things, these kind of tools, for example, enable us to see what is the air renewal rates that happen in a city, depending on whether the buildings are flat roofed or pitch roofed or whatever. So we have the possibility to look at this, and it is crazy to keep thinking that it doesn't matter exactly how buildings are. This is a kind of decision that doesn't really matter. It's aesthetic. It's not aesthetic. I mean, the fight between the pitch roof and the flat roof is a classic of let's say history of architecture. Actually, when the modernist architects were fighting against the pitch roofs, and then the kind of postmodernists were fighting against the flat roof, they didn't know this. Today we do. We can model these things and have quantifiable information and decide whether one is or not, one is better than the other. And I think to not look at this as the rock bottom of the practice is insane, it's crazy. It only extends the ignorance and the paradigm of the post-truth, of the fake. And so these are some other things that we are involved in this idea of returning to some sort of architectural truth or radical quantification and measurability, which are kind of high resolution, low cost, high spatiotemporal environmental sensing projects, which we have been involved with, but I'm not going to kind of talk about this. I'm going to now move to a proposal which is kind of deliberately polemical, which is how will the architecture, I mean, these are technologies which are related to architecture, but I would like to make some sort of fast forward and see, okay, provided that we operate like this, what will be likely the architecture that comes out of this, in a way, post-human, not socially constructed approach to the built environment. And so I think that this kind of in a way polemical proposal, but I think, I mean, I think we should discuss it. But the proposal that I would like to put on the table is that supposed to what one could imagine the future of architecture should look like. I would like to put forward the proposal that the more we are able to measure these building physics phenomena, the more we are going to move towards an architecture that I would like to call, I mean, I've called it in a kind of ironic way, neoconservative or neoconservativist, which is that is an architecture that is maybe symmetrical, repetitive, regular, compact, and that is in some ways using or coming back to certain traits that were more common to some sort of traditional or conservative architecture. And the reason why you know, the whole idea of the conservative or the conservativist is something that is in all the discourses that are around the practice of architecture. So we now are supposed to preserve the climate, preserve biodiversity, preserve the city, conserve energy. So there is this incredible, I mean, the opposite, what is happening with the war. No? The war is kind of destroying everything. So the opposite would be to try to use the urban capital in order to reduce the expense of building the environment. And when we build something, and this is the kind of the reason why I believe that that this measurement, the the capacity to measure in detail parameters in a building is over time is going to lead us, for example, to organizations that are symmetrical. I mean, if you remember, for example, the theories from Bruno Sevi, who used to say, and in general, modernists used to say that asymmetry is better than symmetry. Symmetry was supposed to be representing the old regime, the order, etc., etc. Asymmetry is was supposed to embody function. So functions were not symmetrical, therefore architecture had to be non-symmetrical. Now my hypothesis here is that on the contrary, the architecture that we need to do today is not determined so much by human functions, because what we need to build are structures that are flexible, that are capable of being constantly reused, the way all buildings are reused. And in that capacity, if we measure, or if we try to construct the forms that are able to be constantly reused, we are going to tend, like natural organizations tend to produce structures that are more regular, because structures that are more regular are normally easier to be reused, and so I think that this hypothesis that I am making here, the architecture that will come out of this quantitative, scientific, measurable architecture will not be about effects and images, but about symmetry, measurability, concreteness, detail, no effect, but kind of explanation, architecture that is kind of didactic and maybe alienated in the Brechtian sense. So this is a kind of idea that we will travel perhaps in a way which we intuitively, it's kind of counterintuitive idea that when we have more powerful tools of quantification, as we do now, this kind of digital technologies, if we look at the organizations that are more effective, we will kind of tend to actually produce entities that are more regular, more symmetrical, more easy to build, more repetitive, more conservative, actually speaking. And so to illustrate this, I'm going to show you 3 projects, which I think are kind of Palladian, almost, or neo-Palladian, to kind of explain this paradox, and that want to, in a way, illustrate this kind of neo-conservationist or neo-conservative approach to architecture, ironically. So, so the first one is a building that we built between, I mean, it was finished in 2008, but was not commissioned until 2020. It's a building that is actually, for some very strange reason, related to COVID-19. It's a institute of legal medicine in Madrid, which is a project that was finished in 2008 and was left as you see it now, as a kind of ruin in Madrid without use, because the whole project where it was located was which was a kind of city of justice, made out of circular buildings. So that was part of the master plan. We didn't invent the circular building. We simply turned the kind of cylindrical building into some sort of sphere, because it was a building related to death, kind of legal issues related to people killed, etc., etc. So, and it's a building that we didn't finish. So halfway through the process, we pull out because we had a kind of serious disagreement with the client, but the building, except the skin, was basically designed entirely by us. And what is I think interesting about the building is that well, I mean, this was the project. It was some sort of sphere with a sphere inside, which was a kind of monumental atrium for burials and things like that. But otherwise, it was a technical building to treat corpses, and it was designed. The scheme was designed in order to be able to use always the same width of a steel cladding. And therefore, we, after different tests, we wore some of these almost like a wool or a football. I mean, like the way you make cover spherical geometry with a linear or with a regular pattern. So we designed it like this. It was built like this. It was not built as it should be. And then basically the whole project collapsed. And I love to look at this picture, because it's like a ruin. It's like the ruin of some sort of enlightenment project in respect to, you know, Durand and Ledoux. Is this kind of monumental project that was left abandoned for 12 years until COVID. So nobody moved into the building. The building was deteriorating, but actually during COVID, the city of Madrid ran out of storage for bodies. And this building happened to have 250 freezers in the basement, which we had installed there. And so suddenly the city covered the project, not only recovered the project, but actually copied or made a hospital, a pandemic hospital around it. Copying actually some of the things that China had done. Like literally, the politicians in Madrid said, "No, we are going to do it like the Chinese, and we are going to build a pandemic hospital around this building that contains dead bodies." So that basically was this experiment. The second project I would like to mention to explain is a project that we completed recently in Vienna. It's also some sort of super symmetrical tower that emerges, in this case, not from a master plan, but from some sort of parametric research, but also and primarily because of certain production concerns or production constraints. It was a competition that we won 2015, I think, also. And what was to be located in this place next to the canal in Vienna. And what was interesting for us when we started the project was that they the brief seemed to be very concerned with wind because Vienna is a very windy city, and they were concerned about the tower and the kind of downdraft and the turbulence of air on the basis of the tower. But they were also subject to, or we were also subject to respond to some local regulations about shadows. So we were not supposed to cast shadow on any other building in the field for more than 2 hours. That's part of the kind of Vienna urban regulations. And so the first tests that we did had to do with how to locate on the site a shape, tower shape that would minimize the amount of shadow cast on other buildings, and we ended up with some sort of rhomboidal shape that then, since it had emerged from the daylight analysis, we thought that it was also interesting in terms of, because it was a little bit like an airfoil. So we kind of shifted from the rhomb to an airfoil, and then we tested the airfoil in that I showed you before, in order to measure the turbulences that are produced and the kind of resistance of the form to wind flow. These are different tests. So you can see basically how the robot can test how to blow on the model from different locations and at different speed to test the downdrafts, etc., etc. And we use this tool in order to test different shapes. I mean, those of you who know how tall buildings operate, you would probably have heard that an extrusion is the form that produces the highest levels of downdraft. And what we were testing here was, from the simple extrusions to kind of more complex shapes, what would be the performance of these shapes in terms of downdrafts. And we actually found out that the one that optimized not just the downdrafts, but almost it was the one that gave us better performance, was this shape, which was using in 85% of the cladding of the tower a regular tilted tile, and then it had these kind of corners where the surface would kind of fold and link between them, and then so it was a form that was not only effective in terms of wind flow, but by doing this kind of very simple twist of the curtain wall, 4.59 degrees, we were able to actually optimize the performance of the building vis-a-vis the predominant levels of or directions of flow. This is the form that came out of this, and the effect that you can see, the form produced in the airflow by comparison with other buildings that are in the field. These were analyses that actually were done outside. We did the first analysis, but then we had to get them tested by experts that would verify them. And this is basically what the form does. You can see how the tower grows and then becomes this form that is, as you can see, always regular. So you always have the same office bay, the same core, and then it's just this tilting, small tilting of the facade that produces the image of the building, and that produces also, I think, the interesting effect in the building, which is some sort of instability, because the mullions are tilted. That is something that is very rare in buildings, to have buildings that have systematically this kind of slightly tilted mullion. And so that is something that we found. We found simply out of doing these wind tests and thinking about how to make the detail of the facade efficiently and economically. And I mean, there were some other considerations. I'm not going to get into this now, but I wanted to show you basically building, which was unfortunately not that. I mean, was also there was some sort of conflict with the client, and you can see the horizontal lines were inadequately colored and given maybe too much presence, but nevertheless you can see the effect of that tilting, slight tilting, and the kind of instability that it produces in the form of the tower, just by having this minor shift in the shape of the building. Oh, I was not supposed. Okay. I had. Okay, so the last project I want to show you, and you know, if you want to see more projects, I can show you more projects. But I thought that these three would be a kind of good example of this kind of interest in symmetry and repetition and regularity and compactness that we are adopting recently the practice. Well, it's a project that we won 2020 through a competition, and is now starting construction in Sejong City, which is the Korean National Museum of Urbanism and Architecture, which is going to be built in this campus in Sejong City. And so I wanted to, in a way, this is perhaps not so much about the measurement of the form, but about the use of certain recycling technologies in order to generate the project. So in this case, the project, the way we explain it to the competition, to the client, was also using this type of concern. So the conundrum that we put forward was, we are making a National Museum of Architecture for the country at a time when we know that making buildings is bad for the environment. That's, I think, the main problem that architects have today, which is why architecture has become a deeply incorrect, politically incorrect activity, which is that every time we do something, we are consuming resources, we are extracting resources, we are consuming energy, etc., etc. So how can we, I mean, a National Museum of Architecture should address this very contemporary issue. And so we started in some ways presenting how, in a way, making the client guilty for having a very large carbon footprint as a country, but then at the same time being very good to and very ambitious in terms of recycling and cost cutting the emissions, the global emissions. So in a way, these were, and so the idea that we presented them with was that it is legitimate to do this because there are certain efficiencies that occur when we make a building that we should not forget. And I think Seoul is a perfect example of this. These are examples of or photographs of Seoul after the war. It was nearly the poorest country in the world, and it was transformed during the 50s and between the 50s and the 90s, primarily because of urban development, primarily because of construction. So the country moved from an extreme poverty economy to maybe one of the wealthiest and most developed countries in the world today through urban development construction. And we thought that the National Museum of Architecture and Urbanism should talk about this transformation and should celebrate architecture because of that. So we wanted to, in some way, use the building to celebrate this golden age of modern Korean development that probably also happened in China. But what is interesting about looking back at the way the city grew, you can see what Seoul was supposed to become in the 1950s. It was a city made with kind of overpasses and infrastructure. That was the future that was envisioned by the politicians. And actually, out of that future, as you may know, now all the overpasses are being dismantled and replaced by rivers that were originally culverted, but now are being reopened. Cheonggyecheon or MVRDV makes this project to use one of these overpasses as an arboretum. So the proposal that we make is for the Korean Museum of Architecture to become a global model for the reuse of structures, while becoming also a monument, a remembrance to that age of optimism and febrile development in the 60s and 70s, in which Korea became an incredibly successful economy by transforming, by investing in the built environment. And so we propose that some of these overpasses that are being dismantled throughout the country were to be reused in the building. And this was not a new idea. It's an idea, the idea of recycling buildings. As you know, urban mining is very old, and there are very beautiful examples in the antiquity, and now it's kind of again fashionable. But the proposal was to build the building as a collection of architectural parts of existing overpasses, of these kind of trusses, and in some ways also to make a museum that did not or challenge the well-known problem of architectural curation. So most architectural buildings, architectural museums in the world are basically reproducing the models of art museums. And in this case, we wanted to try something more similar to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, which you might know, where there are literally chunks of architecture that are built within the structure of the building. So in some ways, the proposal, these are more pictures of the Pergamon Museum. So the proposal was to reuse these beams from the highway overpasses in order to make this scaffolding, where we would then locate one-to-one mock-ups of buildings in such a way that even the facade of the building could be curated in order to present these fragments of architectures as part of the collection, future collection of the Museum of Korean Museum of Architecture. And so this was the way in which we were piling these beams extracted, recycled from highway overpasses, and that were also in some ways reminiscent of some of the traditional Hanok ifs of Korean architecture. So there was a kind of relationship between the traits of the Korean architecture and the recycling of infrastructural elements. So the building is otherwise, as I said, also very Palladian, if you want, very order symmetrical. There is no attempt to do anything but to simply make this scaffolding made out of overpass beams in order to locate one-to-one mock-ups of architecture. I'm not going to explain the building, but basically has a kind of basement where most of the facilities and the permanent collection are located. And then it has like an emerging element, which is a kind of tower, which is what is built with these recycled elements. As you can see here, the building is mostly underground, and there is this kind of archive. The tower is basically where the archive of the collection is going to be located, and it's a kind of accessible archive. So the archive will become part of the accessible areas in the museum, but this scaffolding of remnants of architecture that is going to be located there, and that we hope and that sits in a kind of treasure garden that will also become a place reminiscent of some of these picturesque images of ruins, but there will be like one-to-one pieces of architecture. This is something that is very rare, if not unprecedented in any architecture museum in the world. It is maybe something we can find in archaeological museums, and it is something that we also thought it was reminiscent of some of these images, which are kind of Asian in a way, not just Korean, also Japanese, and probably also Chinese, in which nature and architecture are put together in a garden, or this kind of collection of building elements located in a landscape, in a garden. So I'm not going to. There are two courtyards. I'm not going to explain very much, where there was some sort of reference to the British Museum in terms of the scale of the spaces that we were using, and again the Pergamon Museum as a model, or even the National Gallery in Berlin. The scale of spaces that we are providing is very much the same as this building, which is obviously also one of our references, except that these slabs are made by using recycled elements, and so that's basically how the building is proposed. There is some sort of central, under the tower, there is a kind of central atrium that is where you can see the location of these beams that are piled on top of each other in order to construct the structure. So the idea is that the construction, the act of construction is made explicit in the architecture museum, and then these are the pores, the storage of pieces that are not curated. That this is kind of accessible storage part of the museum, where we will be, or the public will be able to see almost literally how the building is put together simply by piling pieces of structure that then act as the scaffolding, where all these other elements of the project are going to be located. and of course, all the air conditioning systems and electrical systems will be deliberately exposed as a didactic experience, where the public will witness directly the assemblage between parts. That has to do with this idea of a didactic architecture, an architecture that explains itself rather than producing some sort of amazing image effects. You can see how the joints are also the details. The joints are very significant, are very important in the design of the building, and we adopt what we call some sort of anatomic surgical approach to the design, where the different elements of construction are systematically and carefully detached from each other through dry construction. And dry construction is also one of the things that we are promoting, like pieces, elements from different buildings are placed together in an idea that is reminiscent of this anatomy class, but also an idea that follows the principles of design for disassembly, in which the resources of the project are made available at the end of its life cycle. So we already, these are images that we have in mind, but we think this is the detail that we should try to explore in this building, a detail in which almost everything is exposed, is directly exposed. The pipes, the air conditioning, the ducts of the air conditioning, even the cabling of the lighting is that our idea is that it should become part of this way, architecture of truth, architecture of everything is in your face. And then there are some other issues that relate to the use of environmental systems that are not centralized, but that use variable VRF systems. Like, this is Daikin versus Carrier, no? In terms of environmental control, and using this kind of grid as a kind of plenum, and also the way in which the building will be built is very much like a kit of parts that are put on top of each other, and the last part of it is actually the facade, where these mock-ups are located. So in a way, the idea is that the building is permanently rebuilt. The facade can be curated, can be rebuilt using different pieces, different parts of other buildings that are part of the museum collection. This is obviously inspired in the experiment I made in Venice during the elements, where we collected a series of facade samples. This is also related to the kind of book that I published recently about the envelope, but where parts of buildings are exposed. So the idea is to make the first global collection. The idea of the museum is that the museum will host, but also will make the first world collection of architectural mock-ups, where all these issues about thermal transfer or waterproofing or all these concerns about the environment, the air, the water, the light, even the vegetation will be able to be experienced by the public. And there is actually a huge collection that is out there and is waiting to be hosted somewhere. So we believe that we will, by making this building, we will suddenly create incredible wealth for the country, for Korea, by being the host of some of these mock-ups, which will be, of course, mixed perhaps with other pieces of architecture that another more typical construction system. So that is the project. I think there was supposed to be an animation which I'm going to run for you to look at, and we can start the questions and answers whenever you want. I mean, I think that one of the interesting things and one of the paradoxes of the project is that, and it's because of the specific nature of the building as an architecture museum that is made with fragments, is that it's almost like you cannot imagine a more postmodern building made with chunks of other pieces of architecture. That's probably not the what is going to constitute the future of this perhaps postmodern paradigm in architecture that I've tried to introduce in the lecture, but you know, I think that the symmetry, the repetition, the construction with repetitive parts, the compactness, and in some ways the fairly conservative approach that all these concerns bring into the project can be perhaps taken as an index of an architecture that I believe is more likely than not to be the architecture of the near future. So, you know, these are the accessible collections. These are the kind of facades. Originally, we wanted to use glass that can change the opaqueness, electrochromic glass that allows to, but we are not going to be able to do that because of budget reasons. Of course, you know, between this kind of ideal version and what we will build, there will be some compromises. But anyway, that's what I had prepared for today. Thank you for your attention. We can, if you want, move to the questions or have a break, whatever you want to do.
Great, thank you. Alejandro, it's time passes very fast. We are totally attracted by your projects and your introduction to your thinking, recent thinking in architecture. I think the lecture is actually from the very beginning of your career, your teaching study all the way to your beginning famous project in Japan, and then all the way go to including your research and methodology you introduce, and also parallel with your thinking in the architecture in the evolution, including the social evolution. I think it's like a short history, and not only for your work, but also the short history of the past decades, I think 20, 30 years, including a very interesting evolution process of architecture history and your practice, and also including your research teaching as well. So it's very very interesting lecture, and fantastic, because I remember years ago, I think 3-4 years ago, you make a lecture. 4 years ago.
Nearly
more
5
than 5 years. Yeah.
Long time ago.
You're adding something, and also including your new thinking on the go back to your topic. Maybe the students were welcome to put forward your question in the chat to Professor. And I would like to ask the first question, because the topic today is the end of manners. So Stu, I want to ask him the ending of the manners. So what do you mean? Really explain the manners, because you talk about a lot about the social or political process and influence to the your thinking, and also you quoting some of the book like the post-truth that is relate even more than the scientific or technology part, but also the political and also the ethical problem right now we're facing after COVID-19, and including the war between Russia and Ukraine. I think it's all influenced a lot by not only the environmental change, but also the special situation, economic situation, and the social situation, which is in a big shifting part. Maybe it's a big moment. We should make some discussion, because last night Professor Shiqiao Li, who is from the States, UVA, also talking about the digital and post-digital age, actually from the formalism to the ethical thinking to the carbon age, how we should be thinking on the planet problem. I think it's like a different perspective, different theory, but actually you both of you actually talk about it's the end of something, an end of the formalism, or end of a certain kind of paradigm should be shift to something different. So would you like to analyze a little bit to the post-truth you mentioned and post-humanism? So how would you like to address, actually, I think a very big change from your early practice to the later practice from a formalism perspective, because your early career, I think, is really like parametric, or this kind of digital geometrical design in some of your projects, and also including your project, the glass project, and it's also kind of a very strong form, sublime form as well. But when you introduce your wind tunnel research and also the sensors in the city, I think it's quite interesting non-human actors you introduce to the architecture design process, which is something more than the formalism. And including your last project, I think it's more than the geometry system. It's actually introduced more political or social understanding or elements, or the assemblage of the spatial elements to your design process. So would you like to analyze the the whole choose arrow you mentioned, what is the real scientific change in your project, and you would like to address your thinking into this process?
Well, I mean, it's a kind of a convergence between different things. First of all, I would like to address your first question, which is why what are the manners? The manners refer to the idea that we can engage in many different ways of doing architecture. Now, that is something that people from my generation and your generation, which is probably very much the same, you are, I think, slightly younger, but still we have grown in an age in which architects were supposed to do something different. I mean, that's a kind of famous statement from Philip Johnson, who is the main character behind American postmodernism. He says, "I do it different." That was his motto, his statement. So, as opposed to modernism, in which people were supposed to comply with certain precepts that had been demonstrated as kind of scientific or truthful, like, I don't know, the long windows, or the fact that the reinforced concrete and steel structures allowed buildings to behave in a different way, or the fact that the cities were supposed to be built around cars and highways. So there were a number of proposals that had become general for everybody, and everybody was working within this frame in the modernist period. Now, postmodernism does the opposite, says, no, this is bullshit, this is the wrong science, and they were right in the critique. Some of the things were wrong. Now we know probably we cannot have cities that are based on cars and highways. But nevertheless, the idea that anything goes, that maybe that was wrong, but we are not proposing something else that improves it. We are simply exploring, having a conversation, playing with forms, etc., was very attractive and very interesting, I think, for the practice, and we have been to some degree educated in that kind of pluralism or relativism, postmodernism. Anything is possible, anything goes. We cannot necessarily say that something is wrong. And I have come to the conclusion, and I think that, as I said, that some of the things that have happened, globally speaking, so architects had their manners. Their manners were their arts, their way of making something different, like Philip Johnson. That was the model of architectural practice between the end of the 70s till now. That's why Charles Jenks used to say, no, we are still postmodern. Even if you think you are not postmodern in the sense of POMO, you are still postmodern. That's what he used to tell me. And he was right, I think. But now we know that there are certain things that we can no longer do if we want to remain relevant, if we want to contribute to the development of buildings and cities. We need to make buildings that are well insulated. We need to make buildings that are perhaps not all made out of glass. There are certain things that we should not demolish buildings. We should not demolish. We should try to kind of reduce buildings. There are certain things that are undeniably right and that are going to constrain the way which we can work with architecture. It's interesting that you put me, you qualify my practice as kind of formalist, but I think I've never been a formalist in the sense that I've been always interested in the, as I tried to explain, behind the Yokohama project, there were calculations, there were the kind of inclination of the ramps for disabled. So I always like the idea that architecture is somehow grounded on effective quantitative issues, and probably I think that you're right that perhaps the Institute of Legal Medicine in Madrid was more of a formalist proposal. I completely agree with you there, but that was back then when we started the project in 2006. That was probably not the form that was favored by the contemporary practice, because in some ways was a form that was derived from a master plan where all the buildings were supposed to be cylinders or have a kind of approximately cylindrical geometry. They were supposed to be contained in a cylinder of a certain diameter and height, and so we were playing with that, and also with death as a kind of symbol, etc. So that is I think an outlier, the work of the practice, and an interesting outlier because it was determined by other reasons, and it produced this kind of hyper-symmetrical shape at the time when symmetry was deeply unfashionable. And so the idea that manners, that we can continue practicing almost as an exploration of multiple languages, I think is one of the things that is going to be terminated by some of the recent events that we are living on in the world. Pandemics, wars, etc., are, I think, suddenly changing the targets of a relevant architectural practice. And I believe that there will be a point in the near future in which certain things will simply not be considered any longer acceptable. Things that we have done also. I mean, I'm not saying, for me, the kind of consciousness, for example, about environmental performance is something that I didn't have when I did Yokohama. When I did Yokohama, I was still interested. I mean, it was not exactly a kind of formalist project, because it was very much driven by certain geometries of tilting floors, etc. But it was much more related with space and structure than with embodied energy or energy consumption. I think if I had to do this project today, I would do it in an entirely different way. And I think that is likely to happen to most of us. And I bet you that if you and I now try to do a project together, we will agree that we will agree on many things. And we will not necessarily be so concerned about our particular style or approach or image, but about starting from some sort of common ground of environmental performance, energy consumption, efficient production, and so on and so forth. So the fact that you and I will probably agree in most things, we may have certain differences, I think is going to be a trend. In the same way that probably Peter Smithson would probably agree with Aldo van Eyck in many things back in the 60s, before the kind of collapse of in 10. So back then, I think architects were much more working around certain issues, globally speaking, as opposed to what happened after, in the postmodern period, in which every architect was trying to do it different. As you know, Philip Johnson or Charles Jenks used to play with that idea of plurality and relativism. I think that the world of relativism is over, and we need to kind of coalesce around certain very important subjects that affect to all of us, China and America, Europe, everywhere. We are going to be facing this. And that's why the lecture was called The End of Manners, because, and I believe that this end of manners has to do with a return to science, with a return to truth, to something that can be found, that we have the tools to measure, we have the tools to find out. Is not enough to simply keep producing images or approaches or narratives that are not grounded on this kind of return to science and truth. I mean, and it may be that you don't agree. I think you agree also on this, but I think there may be people, there may be architects who don't agree on this idea, and I believe that they are wrong. And I think that we should have the courage to say, no, there are certain things that are wrong. Same way that modern architects used to dismiss certain types of neoclassical architecture because they were not functional, and function was so that convergence, I think, is what is going to be the end of manners, the end of stylistic traits, and the tendency back towards some sort of common project on a global scale. I mean, you asked me maybe some more questions that I didn't answer. Is there something else that you asked me that maybe you would like to insist on? I mainly the idea of the end of manners.
Yeah, I think it's interesting for you to analyze. It's really interesting about actually it's the end of manners. Point out the end of maybe not only modernism but also postmodernism, the understanding of what is form, what is actually the signal, and what is actually the functional, the function of program-based design is all kinds of manners already should be end, but you specialize in maybe to visualize some truths, and that truth maybe should base on the scientific rules or scientific methodologies to help us to understanding more about the environment, about the planetary problems we are facing, right? I think that's a quite good point. Actually, I strongly support. I think it's also what I'm struggled to do. I think it's also we name it a post-digital things. It's more than the formalism of digital. It's something about the more essential or interesting to make the new convergence, as you mentioned, about the environmental problem with the architecture issue, architecture discipline. I think that is something interesting. I think I got a lot of enlightenment from your lecture. I think that's something interesting part. And we have two questions actually from the students. I would like to ask maybe the students. If you want to ask by yourself, I read for you. The first student, she said, I know you are practicing architect. What interests you? What interests you more?
I see that.
You can see.
I see. I didn't open the chat before, so I am seeing.
Is it a spatial form of buildings or the choice of materials? What do you think about when you start design to determine the concept and form?
I mean, I think it's both. I think it's both, but they are related. They are not independent. So a certain form is related to a certain material, and it happens that I have now for several years, probably because the fact that I won a big project very young put me immediately in contact with the problem of building, and therefore, I became very interested in materials. And I think it's very interesting to look back, and even to look back to relatively recent architecture of people that are younger than me. I mean, this is particularly true in America. Where a number of architects that are, let's say, now around 40 years or 40 something, maybe between 40 and 50, have gone back to some sort of historical approach in which buildings are deliberately immaterial. So they're painted. There has been some sort of interest, aesthetic interest, in the absence of material. So you suddenly see, I mean, the kind of famous millennial pink, that you see in many of the works of people in the US and maybe also in Europe. You see some sort of neo-postmodern aesthetic that was quite prominent until recently. Like suddenly history became again important. I'm talking, I mean, in Europe also, like people like Pier Vittorio Aureli, for example. If you look at the architect, and I mean, I have absolute respect for everybody, or people like Michael Meredith in the States, or Mark Lee. They have been working almost back to some sort of almost like a postmodern materiality, in which the material is not relevant. The material is paint. It's painted stucco, or painted, and I think that this is, for me, is one of the things that I've never been keen on that type of architecture, but I know why, and I think one of the reasons why I don't think that that's an architecture that will succeed in the near future is because it's an architecture that in some ways conceals things. I think as part of this quest for truthful architecture, we are going to see an increasing emergence of the raw materiality. It's almost like kind of return to modernism, return to Mies, return to Corbusier, return to grit, return to raw textures rather than finishes. So the way in which the recent architecture has been driven by some sort of random, playful recycling of historical archetypes that are immaterial. That is one of the things that I think will not work in the near future. But of course, I mean, the other reason why materials have become relevant, and this is something that I am, when I designed Yokohama, I had no idea about embodied energy. Nobody has ever told me anything about embodied energy. Now, when we are doing a building, I could have shown you other projects that are perhaps less symmetrical or less regular. I was basically almost trying to be deliberately polemical about this, but I think that the fact that we know these things now, which we didn't know, we know what is the U value of a wall. We can calculate the weight of a building. I think to have these numbers in mind when we are designing is crucial. It's crucial. That has to do with the truth, with this kind of return of the truth to, Buckminster Fuller used to or ask Norman Foster, how heavy is your building? What is the weight of your building? So weight of the building means embodied energy. So if we make buildings that are lighter, we will have less embodied energy. So there are certain things that we can certainly say today are better. We can almost like compare two buildings, and even one of them is perhaps not moving or not aesthetically pleasing immediately. We can say that the building that has less embodied energy or the building that has better thermal performance is better than the other one. And I think that to keep saying, no, but let people be free about their opinion about the architecture. No, we need to kind of go back to a situation where we have some sort of global consensus, because this is something that affects all of us, China and in the States and in Europe and in Africa and South America. There are issues that affect all of us, that affect the planet, and we need to address these kind of planetary issues, and they are very much in the choice of materials that we make. So we know, for example, that if we build in, I have a project that I was doubting to show you more projects, but maybe another time, that we made entirely in wood. We have been working in wood recently a lot because wood is a carbon trap. So if all buildings are made out of wood, basically cities become carbon traps instead of carbon emitters. So material is suddenly more important than before, and material is going to be ethically and functionally more important than before, but it needs to also be aesthetic. It will, because of this tendency, material, my prognosis here is that material will become increasingly relevant in respect to the design of buildings in the near future. That we are going to assist some sort of return of the raw materiality as an aesthetic trend. So of course geometry is important, and I am a kind of determinist, so I believe that geometry is determined by other things. This is why I said I've never considered myself a formalist, even if I know that maybe some of these kind of free-floating forms have been have been associated to some sort of formalist architecture. As I said, my approach to digital design was much more, from the beginning, much more quantitative, much more scientific than related to the production of an image or the production of a form. Should I?
Yes,
Okay.
good. I think it's an interesting question because it's a big question about the material process. And you mentioned the new choose actually, which is based on scientific methodology to re-understanding and material making process. I think it's a kind of process-based creativity in the future. And just a form-based design process. It's actually a process based on the scientific analysis or scientific understanding of the building with the environment, and also the convergence of different elements, different factors into the design process. I think it's a very interesting thinking, which actually give us a deep thinking on the future pedagogy, how the new shift should happen in the pedagogy in architecture teaching. So let's go to another. We have two more questions. The second question is about in the specificity of the quantitable vast amount of data enables the choice of the creativity. You mentioned the example of details being more interesting than the overall design. And how do you bridge the institute gap of interpretation and classification of data that is necessary for the design process? What principles enable the access to singular choose in the context of organizing acquired information?
Yeah, I mean, it is almost impossible to answer the question because it probably relates to the specific problem. But I believe that one of the things that, or one of the technologies that is related, that is part of the digital, that is emerging and is going to, bulldoze everything is big data. The fact that we are increasingly able to count on larger and larger amounts of data that are collected by sensors and by simply kind of internet data, and those data. I mean, I'm not gonna say that are going to be able to determine everything, because there will be obviously areas of indetermination. But I would recommend, and I would certainly subscribe, a type of architectural practice where the project is first shaped by the data. And then, there will be moments of indetermination where we will have to make decisions, perhaps based on kind of aesthetic preferences and things like that. But I like the idea that we are not infinitely free, but we are constrained by data, and is in very small details where the architecture, the relevant architecture is. That's why I insist so much in the detail. In the whole book about the envelope is all about understanding details, and not understanding details as recipes, but understanding details almost as moments of equilibria between different forces that were present in the project and that were fighting, and they end up in a certain way. but behind this kind of temporal or specific or local closure, they are part of a larger evolution, of a larger trend. So my increasing commitment and interest on materiality and detail has to do with looking at architecture almost as a gesture, which is this formalist gesture that we intuitively associate to the early parametric, but actually the parametric is not parametric per se. It's not formalist. Parametric is the opposite of formalist. Parametric means that that you don't have a form, but you have a series of parameters. And if instead of looking at the form and how to make the form more or less interesting, you look at the parameters behind the form, then you have an entirely different view of the project. And I think is that perspective of the close attention of the detail of the material and its implications in terms of extraction or processing or transportation, carbon emissions, energy, embodied energy, that is going to become increasingly relevant. And I think that the big challenge that we have to overcome now is the fact that the public out there are accustomed to architecture as something that is extravagant. It's a kind of visible gesture. It's a kind of Frank Gehry or Zaha Hadid, or and the public in general look at buildings and say, "Oh, that is an interesting piece of architecture because it's extravagant." And I think our role now, I mean, and I'm not criticizing. I mean, I love Frank Gehry and Zaha, and it's not that I don't think that this is a relevant architecture. I think that is an approach that will be increasingly unfeasible, and that we somehow need to develop in the public the sensibility to understand embodied energy. How on earth can we express embodied energy in a building that we design so that the public at large can understand it? It has to do with a process of education. It has to do with a process of awareness that we need to do as architects if we want to contribute to this world, to reduce carbon emissions and energy consumption, and to address some of the things that we can address. I mean, there's no question that we have the technologies to make better cities, but at the moment the public is not engaged. Well, I mean, we haven't been able to produce an aesthetic trend that would explain to the public these are better cities. And I don't know how we are gonna do it. I mean, I know what we have to do. I know that we have to use wood. I know that we have to use prefabrication. I know that we have to use compactness. I know that we have to use, but how do we turn this into some sort of style that is understandable by the public? That is a problem I don't know how to resolve. And I don't know, I think it's going to be very difficult because it's simply much more subtle. When we work on the details, I mean, how are we going to make sure that the public looks at the details? The details is something that we know about because we are experts. But how are we going to be able to create a sensibility that is accessible to the public regarding these problems, where probably the most relevant issues today are contained, but in a very discreet way. That's, I think, a very difficult challenge for the whole profession. How to change the mindset of the general public from architecture as some sort of extravagant expression to something that is actually producing certain environmental effects. And we know we can measure these effects. We can demonstrate through statistics and data and measurements that our buildings are better or can be better if we do certain things. But how do we turn this into something that the public can understand without having to understand the data? This is what is difficult. So
good. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Mention the data is actually it's kind of information and how to actually organize this information into the design process, and actually it's kind of something new paradigm coming. I think it's when you're posting out the end of the manners, it should be something a start. I think as in your lecture today, it's about the scientific based measuring methodologies to create maybe a future formalism. Yes, I think it's an interesting question you put forward for a lot of understanding or the thinking on your lecture in the near future. So then let's go to the last question, because we need to wrap the lecture in like 5 minutes. So the last question is about because of the war and the pandemic, and the cost of buildings has been reduced. So start to consider recycling of the buildings. Or is it because of the political hypocrisy that the people increasingly need to be correct and precise? I noticed that you seem to mention that the truth of architecture begins to lead to the single goal, no longer diversification and the relativity. What does this mean? Do you understand the question? Students' portfolio.
Yeah, I think I roughly understand that. I mean, again, all these questions are almost like very difficult to answer, very some way philosophical or metaphysical almost. So one of the things that I say now when I lecture, which is I say in a deliberately polemical way, is that there is only one truth, and I am convinced about this. I mean, I think that this is a metaphysical question. If we were able to know everything, we will know what the truth is. Well, I mean, this is almost like kind of, as I said, it's a metaphysical issue. I think if you talk to philosophers, etc., they will tell you that that is true. The question is whether we can access that truth. But the idea that has been driving our political and our moral and our aesthetic performances, and I'm talking about global, let's say some sort of global culture, has been based very much on the fact that there is no truth, that there is not a single truth, that there are multiple opinions, and that truth is relative, and that you cannot say there is a single truth. But I think that you read metaphysics, the question is not whether it's a truth. The truth is there. The reality is there. The question is whether we can reach it, or whether anybody is entitled to say, I have the truth. Because I mean, that's what becomes dangerous, politically speaking, when somebody says no more relativity, I have the truth, and therefore you have to do what I tell you. Now, how are we going to converge? I mean, this is the problem I was mentioning before about convergence. I think that while it is probably difficult to agree on an ultimate truth, I think that we can agree to many things. And I think this is why I find disturbing to see that there are people who are now questioning evolution, for example, or people that are questioning the fact that there is climate change happening. There are people who are saying, no, this is a lie, this is an invention, but there is evidence, there is science that explain that neither creationism is true. Nor, so we have diminished the value of truth to the point in which anybody can say anything. You know, the whole populist scene, the whole activist proposal is based on certain narratives that you cannot question. Cannot. I mean, there are people who are saying that humans have a gradation of sexes, while everybody knows that there are only two sexes, and this is something that is genetically determined in the DNA of a person. No matter what you feel, or who do you like, or what is your sexual behavior, you belong to one or the other type, because you're a human, and that's the way the biology works. And so to keep finding arguments that go right against things that are scientifically demonstrable is where we are now. I don't know how we are going to be able to shift from thinking that anything goes, and yes, you can go and play in women's sports, even if you are biologically a male, because you feel a female. The whole idea that everything is driven by feeling and by by opinion and by partisan performance is what has taken us to a situation where Putin is invading Ukraine, saying that there are Nazis there, and that all these kind of war crimes are faked, or that I mean, we've gone to a point where anything goes, and that is what cannot happen, and it cannot happen politically, and it cannot happen architecturally. In some cases, there are certain architectural attitudes that are no longer ethical, no longer justified in the kind of environmental degradation, energy consumption situation where we are in, and they need to be. I mean, they need to be banned. Like, I mean, I know it sounds very aggressive and radical, but I genuinely believe that there are certain things where of course, it's a kind of approximation. So it's not as if I am saying there is only my way of doing things, but there are certain things where, for decades we know certain things, and there are certain cultural trends that are no longer viable. That's, I mean, when I forgot to answer to your first question related to posthumanism. I think that some of the problems have to do with the idea that that the world can be so that everything is socially constructed. Social constructivism is a problem because there are things. I mean, you cannot construct socially gravity or thermal transfer the same way that you cannot construct socially sexual identity. There are certain things that are material, physical, and no matter how much you would like to for them to be, I mean, you cannot challenge the fact that there are smarter and dumber people and stronger and weaker, like physical bodies or brains. And this is, I mean, it's crazy to think that everybody is the same, that we can construct absolute equity across people. There have been historically certain regimes, political regimes that have tried to do that and crashed against the reality. And so what we are seeing now is that under this relativist postmodern intellectual regime, we are back there with a vengeance. And I think that we have to fight these ideologies because they're false, they're fake, they're not facing the truth, the physical truth. And some of them are supposed to be politically correct. No? I mean, the whole gender or race issue in the US is kind of very charged, not so much probably in Asia, but in the US is incredible. And there are certain things that cannot be, they're taboo. They're taboo, even if they are true, they are taboo, they cannot be stated.
Good. Good.
Whether I answer or not.
Yeah, it's all very interesting, but very big questions goes to your lecture. I think we need time to understanding more, rethinking your very special idea and attitude to the special position we want to address, to orientate where we are and what's the next in architecture discipline. I would like to send the invitation because we introduced the journal Architecture Intelligence. Normally we have some like big iconic professor architects write some commentary paper to put forward like the manifesto in architecture. I think the topic today is very interesting. We would like to invite you maybe to contribute the end of manners. Could you like to write a short commentary paper for us in our journal, probably introduce your idea and the scientific methodology. You want to actually the scientific method is measuring the invisibility to bridging human with nature. I think that is something very super interesting to the what's the next for us in architecture discipline. I think if you have time, I think would like to invite you to contribute a short article, manifesto article to us to put forward your idea in a very interesting way. So thanks a lot, Alejandro. I think it's already very late here in China. Thanks for our time and thanks for your great lecture and to show your very deep thinking in the pedagogy and also including the practice of a recent based on the recent situation and the COVID, and also I think the different understanding of the environment and the the national relations and the human and nature relations. I think it's all should make discussion in the future. So thanks a lot, Alejandro. I think it's a great opportunity for us to introduce you more to the platform of Digital Futures, and also we will upload the lecture to the YouTube and Bilibili. I think more people will check and learn this video in the future. So thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you for the invitation. Pleasure to be
Thank
here.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Have a good day. Let's keep in touch by email. I was, yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank
bye-bye.
you. Thank you. Bye.